Hello, and welcome to my channel, Kersey Books. Today I want to talk about 3 different things, and I've broken this video up into chapters so you can jump ahead to whatever piece might interest you. First of all, I just really want to quickly tell you that after the whole debacle with taking pandemic down, doing the other one, which if you care what this is about and you don't know, you can look at my last video that I'll also link in the description, I guess, if you really care. But I just wanted to update you that the views are increasing, it's all good, and I've moved on. So that's the end of that. But the more important thing is what's coming next. And the audiobook that I'm doing next is my EMP Collapse series. So the first book, Chaos Begins, will be out later this week. After that, I will do Chaos Rises and then Chaos Soars. So the whole series will be up soon. And at the end of this video, I will put the first 2 chapters of Chaos Begins as kind of a sneak peek so you can get started on the story. And then the entire book will be out at the end of the week. So watch for that. One other thing though about this audiobook is I'm doing the narration, which some of you may prefer me to hire a professional, but it's pretty pricey. However, if there's a 5th pandemic book, which it's looking like there might be, I will have Andrew Tell narrate that book just for consistency and having the same narrator for the whole series. But outside of that, I'll be doing the narrating of my books, and if you don't like it, you certainly don't have to listen, but that's the direction I've decided to go. I also wanted to make clear that even though I'm creating the audiobooks for these 3 books in the EMP Collapse series, that's not the end of the series. I'm actually almost done writing the 4th book, and when I'm done with that, I'll create the audiobook for that as well. There's going to be a 5th book, probably a 6th book, down the road. So this won't be the entire series up on audio, but so I just wanted to make sure you understood that. I'm going to take a pause after this 4th EMP Collapse book and probably write that 5th pandemic book. I'll make the announcement once I've actually begun writing it to make sure it's actually going to happen, but it probably will. The other thing that I really need your feedback on is I've been researching and looking into doing something like a Patreon or something similar where you can subscribe to my Patreon, and one of the tiers would be something that would allow you to have access to my entire library of audiobooks ad-free. And I was thinking of pricing it at like $8 a month. So if that's something you think you'd be interested in, would you let me know in the comments, because I don't know that I want to put all the time and effort into setting all that up if no one's going to care. And I was going to have a few tiers where you could just contribute a couple bucks a month just to help support my efforts in creating my audiobooks. So I'm looking into that. So let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. Let's get started on Chaos Begins. You can listen to the first few chapters and kind of get a taste for it. And then, like I said, later on this week, the entire book will be up on YouTube. So enjoy and let's get started. Chaos Begins. EMP Collapse Book 1. Written and narrated by Kersey. Copyright 2021 by Kersey. Chapter 1. Melissa. When the power went out, Melissa Clark's first thought was that she hadn't saved the changes to her PowerPoint presentation before her computer had abruptly shut off. The presentation was due at the end of the day, and it was already 2:30. How was she going to get it done now? Groaning in frustration, she realized how dark it was. With her cubicle in the basement of the building in downtown Salt Lake City, and no window in her cube, the darkness was nearly absolute. Like a moth drawn to a porch light, when Melissa noticed sunshine trickling in through a high but small window in her coworker's cubicle across the way, she pushed back from her desk and headed directly there. "Hey," she said to Tamara, before sitting in an empty chair beside her friend's desk. Tamara was frantically writing something on a notepad in the dim light. "Hang on a sec." After a few moments, she set the pen down and turned to Melissa. "Sorry, I was in the middle of writing a great email response when the power went out." She grinned. "I didn't want to forget my brilliant reply." Melissa chuckled until she remembered her PowerPoint. "Yeah, I lost some of my brilliant work." Tamara grimaced in reply. Then she smiled. "Maybe we can go home early." "I wouldn't mind that," Melissa said, "except I have to finish that presentation." She softly sighed. Guess I can do it from home. I'm sure the power's on there. Craning her head to see a strip of blue sky out of the high basement window in Tamara's cubicle, Melissa smiled. In the meantime, maybe we can enjoy the rest of this beautiful day. I mean, even though it's March, it's not too cold out. Tamara nodded. True, it's at least 40 degrees. Another one of Melissa's coworkers, Rob, stepped into the space. Hey, let's go into the hallway. There should be emergency lights on out there. The women agreed and followed Rob through the dark office space toward the door that led to the hallway. Rob opened the door, which was when they saw that the hallway was just as dark as their office. That's weird, Rob said. The emergency lights should be on. Maybe they don't come on right away, Tamara suggested. Melissa reached into her pocket and pulled out her cell. Let me turn on my flashlight app. She pressed the button to wake her phone, but nothing happened. Huh. What's wrong? Tamara asked. Continuing to press the button, Melissa frowned. My phone won't turn on. In the darkness, she could barely make out Tamara and Rob trying their phones. Mine's not working either, Rob said. What the heck? Tamara said. Mine's dead too. Melissa turned back the way they'd come and squinted in the direction of the main part of the office, where there was a bit of light coming in through a pair of small, high windows. Though she couldn't see a whole lot, she could see there were people there, and she could hear them talking. Let's see what everyone else is doing. The three of them began to make their way toward the voices, careful not to run into anything in the weak light. They joined the larger group who stood near the windows. Light seeped into the space, but it was less than adequate. One of the men was tapping at his cell phone. Hey, Colin, he said to another man in the group. Is your cell phone working? Mine won't turn on. Colin pressed a few buttons. Nope, mine's dead too. So are ours, Melissa said to the group as a sense of foreboding washed over her. That's really odd, Colin said. I mean, even if all the cell towers were disabled somehow, that wouldn't kill the phones completely. What about some sort of power surge? Someone else asked. What kind of power surge would be strong enough to take out cell phones that aren't even plugged into a wall outlet? Colin asked. The more she mulled it over, the more Melissa thought she knew what might have occurred. As a fan of post-apocalyptic fiction, she'd read about this kind of thing, although she'd never imagined it would actually happen. Shoving aside images of all the horrible things that might be on the horizon, she softly exhaled before speaking. An EMP would do it. Her voice was soft, but all eyes swiveled in her direction. An EMP? A man in a suit asked, his voice filled with incredulity. Wondering how many of her co-workers knew what an EMP was, she said, An electromagnetic pulse could take out the power grid and our cell phones. Holy crap, someone muttered. What would cause an EMP? A woman asked. I can think of two things, Melissa said. One, a nuclear explosion detonating miles above us in the atmosphere. Or two, a really big solar flare called a coronal mass ejection. A solar flare wouldn't cause this, a man said, disbelief thick in his voice. Actually, Rob said, it already has. Ever heard of the Carrington event? Melissa was grateful to have someone else back up her claim. Not that it really mattered. Something terrible had happened whether people wanted to believe it or not. No, the man said in reply to Rob. What's that? Back in 1859 there was a CME. He nodded toward Melissa. A coronal mass ejection. It was called the Carrington event. It wreaked havoc on the telegraph system, in some cases sending sparks through the lines and setting paper on fire. That doesn't sound like that big of a deal, the man said. Rob chuckled. Not if your biggest technology is a telegraph system. But nowadays, with everything computerized, imagine everything being hit by something that powerful. He did a chin lift toward the space where they stood and all the desks with computer monitors on them. Now it would be a big deal. A very big deal. Like, catastrophic. So you think it was a CME? Someone asked. He nodded toward Melissa again. Or a nuclear explosion high in the atmosphere like Melissa said. That would take out all the electronics. I think it's time to go home, Tamara said. If our cars work, Rob said. Oh, crap. Melissa had forgotten that an EMP would kill most of the cars. Our cars? Tamara asked. Yeah, Rob said. Unless it's a really old car, like pre-1970s old. Anything newer has electronic components. An EMP would take those out, which means those cars won't work. Are you sure? Tamara asked, with hope lighting her voice. Desperately hoping that she and Rob were wrong, Melissa said, Only one way to find out. The group began moving toward a nearby stairwell that would take them up to the ground floor. Following them, Melissa didn't bother to stop and get her car keys from her purse stashed in her cubicle. The usefulness of her nearly new car would be obvious soon enough when her coworkers tried to start theirs. Feeling her way up the stairs, she eventually reached the first floor along with everyone else. With large glass doors at both ends of the hallway, plenty of light filled the space. A few people were standing around talking in small groups. Where are you guys going? One man called to Melissa's group. To see if our cars will start, Rob answered. Why wouldn't they start? The man asked in obvious confusion. We think there's been an EMP, Rob answered. Everyone who had been standing around in the hallway was listening to the exchange. Are you kidding? Someone asked. Rob shook his head, then moved toward the door that led to the parking lot. Melissa and everyone else followed. Those who had their car keys went to their cars. Melissa watched as they climbed in. Tamara stopped next to Melissa. Do you really think they won't start? She asked. Still hoping she was wrong, when Melissa saw someone get out of a car wearing an expression of both fear and disbelief, she knew she was right. Heart clenching with the realization that this was the beginning of something unimaginable, Melissa bit her lip and glanced at Tamara, but didn't reply. One by one, each person who had tried to start their car stepped out of their vehicle, wearing the same shell-shocked look. This is crazy, Tamara murmured. Pushing aside her concerns, Melissa turned to Tamara with a grimace. Now I wish I'd worn more comfortable shoes. Why do you say that? Tamara asked. Unless you have a bicycle stashed somewhere around here, you and the rest of us will be walking home. Oh my gosh, Tamara said. That's like 15 miles. Melissa glanced at her own 3-inch heel boots that she wore with her slacks. They were comfortable enough to wear at work, but walking home in them would be a challenge. I know, Tamara. I live 20 miles from here. As she thought about the time it would take to walk that distance, she knew there was no way she would be able to make it home before dark. As she imagined the danger she might face on her trek home, panic surged within her. Watching the people walk away from their useless vehicles and back toward where she and Tamara were standing with a group of other observers, Melissa thought about her husband and children. Her husband, Alex, worked several miles south of Melissa's office, on the way home, but she had no idea what his next move would be. They had never discussed what to do in this kind of emergency. Why would they? Who could have imagined something like this actually happening? She'd always believed that the fiction she'd read was just that. Now, though, she regretted not taking the idea of this happening seriously. Shaking away the thought, she pictured her 3 children. All of them were at school, but both schools were less than a mile from home. Both 17-year-old Jason and 15-year-old Emily were at the high school. 13-year-old Stephen was at the middle school, which was only a few blocks from home. Melissa fervently hoped they would all head straight home and not go off to friends' houses. Even so, the thought of them being at home completely on their own until she or Alex could get there was unsettling. Not because they were irresponsible, in fact, they were all really good kids, but because of the chaos that would inevitably ensue when people realized that society was in the midst of a collapse. Chapter 2. Alex. Alex looked through the glass wall in his office toward the reception area. The power had just gone out, but sunlight from the glass doors at the entrance to the small building let in enough light for him to see that his coworkers were beginning to gather in the small foyer. He stood from his desk and joined them. Wonder how long it will be out, someone said. Probably not long, Greg said. Alex hoped he was right. He had a lot of work to do. As a product development engineer for a laser company, he kept extremely busy. He wondered if the power was out at Melissa's office. Her building was in downtown Salt Lake, several miles north of where he was. It seemed unlikely they would both have a power outage at the same time, not on such a clear spring day. Still, he wanted to ask her. He took his phone out of the pocket of his dark gray slacks and tilted it up like he always did to wake it, but the screen remained black. He pressed the power button. Nothing happened. "That's weird," he murmured. No one heard him over their own conversation. He pressed the buttons to turn the phone off, waited several seconds, then long pressed the power button to turn it back on. Nothing. Last time he checked, his battery had been nearly full. He looked at the people around him who were busy chatting and joking. "My phone won't turn on," he said. Greg shifted his eyes to Alex. "Battery's probably dead." "I don't think that's it," although he didn't want to consider what it might actually be. "Does yours work?" He fervently hoped it would. Greg pulled his phone out of his pocket and tapped the screen. Nothing happened. He pressed the power button. Still nothing. Huh. This got everyone else trying. Not a single phone worked. Oh no, Alex thought, as mounting dread swept over him. It was becoming increasingly clear that Alex's worst fear was being realized, and he had no way to get in contact with Melissa, who would have been affected as well. Did she realize it was an EMP? If so, what would she do? Should he go to her office, or should he go home where the kids would, hopefully, be safely waiting? Slight panic began to build inside him. He needed to protect his family. That was the kind of thing he did. But how could he when he was miles away from them and completely unsure what they were all doing in the situation? Because he knew if this was an EMP, cell phones and electricity wouldn't be the only things that had stopped working. Most cars wouldn't run either. At least, that had always been the theory. But theories were sometimes wrong. Often wrong, in fact. Fresh hope surged inside him. Not waiting to see what anyone else's theory might be, he walked away from the group and toward the glass doors. He stopped in front of them, waiting for them to automatically slide open like they usually did. They stayed in place. Duh, the power was out. They wouldn't open without power. Annoyed with himself for not thinking straight, he strode back through the main space and down a short hallway toward the side door exit. It was extremely dark in the hallway, but he knew his way and had no trouble reaching the exit. He pushed the door open. Sunlight streamed through the doorway. He squeezed his eyes closed against the sudden brightness, then walked out into the parking lot, going straight to his truck. He took his keys out of his pocket and pressed the unlock button on his key fob, then grabbed the handle on the driver's door. It was still locked. The key fob hadn't worked. Not a good sign. Going old school, he inserted his key into the lock and turned it, then opened the door. He slid inside, then jammed his key into the ignition, a sliver of hope dancing inside him. He turned the key to start his truck. Nothing, not even a click. Swearing quietly, he tried again, then once more. It was dead, completely and utterly dead. He lifted his eyes to see that his co-workers had all flooded out of the building. They were going to their cars as well. These were not stupid people. They had obviously figured out the same thing Alex had, that somehow an EMP had taken out the power grid and everything else that ran on computer chips, which was just about everything in today's world. Concern growing, Alex got out of his truck and looked around, hopeful that someone's car would be old enough to be immune. The sound of an engine starting reached his ears. With his heart stuttering, he spun around. Colton's classic Mustang had started right up. Yes! Alex hurried over to him, as did everyone else whose cars were now nothing but huge chunks of metal. About 15 people surrounded Colton's Mustang, all wearing smiles of relief. "Can I get a lift?" someone asked. "Me too," another person said. "Same here," a third person said. "I can only fit 3 people," Colton said, his expression apologetic. "4 if we really cram in." I live in Ogden. Who else lives that way? Ogden was in the opposite direction of Alex's house, like an hour away from Alex and Melissa's house, and that was in normal traffic. If this was an EMP, the interstate would be clogged with stalled cars, which meant getting home from Ogden could take hours. Then again, walking would take a heck of a lot longer than that. Maybe Alex could get Colton to drop him off at Melissa's office. At least that way he could protect her as she headed home. But what if she managed to get a ride from someone at her work? Someone who had a car that was functional? That would put him that much farther from home. Even so, it was worth a try. Alex opened his mouth to make his suggestion, but 4 people who either lived in Ogden or on the way there were already climbing into Colton's Mustang, and 2 other people were getting angry that there wasn't room for them. Crap, Alex thought as he shook his head in frustration. Now what? Chapter 3. Melissa. As Melissa imagined people doing whatever they wanted because the authorities were either overwhelmed or busy caring for their own families, a sharp sense of fear rolled through her chest. Even more frightening, when food ran out, which was sure to happen rapidly, and people realized the food delivery system had been terminated and no more food would be coming, there was no telling what desperate acts people would be willing to commit to keep themselves and their families fed. Forcing those worries away, she tried to focus on the immediate problem, how to get home quickly and safely. It was now 3 o'clock, and since it was late March, there were about 4 hours of daylight left. At least it wasn't too cold that day, about 40 degrees, although once the sun set, it would get a lot colder. "What are you going to do?" Tamara asked, her forehead creased with worry. Melissa looked around at the other people, who looked as perplexed as she felt. "I'm not sure what to do. It's kind of late in the day. Do you think we could make it home before dark?" "What kind of pace do you think we could keep?" Tamara asked. "On the treadmill, I can walk almost 4 miles an hour, but that's my upper limit, and that's for about 15 minutes. Melissa frowned. "And that's wearing comfortable shoes. So, realistically, I can probably go about 2.5 to 3 miles an hour for a long time." She grimaced. "Maybe." And that was if they didn't run into any trouble. Tamara looked thoughtful. "So, it would take you about 7 hours to get home, and me about 5. Melissa sighed. "Yeah, it'll be way past dark before we make it all the way home." As her imagination conjured up all kinds of nighttime dangers in a situation where there was no electricity, no cell phones, no working vehicles, and probably no law enforcement, her heart began to pound. "The thought of being out after dark freaks me out, Tamara." "What about Alex? What if you met up with him?" "That would be great, but I don't know what he's going to do or which roads he'll be taking, and no way to contact him." Melissa shook her head. "I can't count on him as a walking companion." She paused. "What about your husband? What do you think he'll do?" Tamara was 30 and had 1 child, a 6-year-old daughter. "Well, Rich only has to commute a few miles to his job, so it won't take him long to get home. And he's usually the one to pick up Abby from school, so I would expect that he'll make sure she's safe. But that doesn't stop me from worrying." "Me too," Melissa said. "My kids are older, though, so hopefully they'll go straight home from school." Sighing with frustration and worry, Melissa ran her fingers through her shoulder-length brown hair. "I just want to get home. Now." "The more time we stand around talking," Tamara said, "the less time we have before dark." Melissa appraised the people standing in the parking lot who were talking in small groups. Then she got an idea. "Hey, everybody," she called out. Everyone turned to look at her. "I'm sure we all want to get home, and I was thinking maybe we could get in groups according to the general area where we live and walk together. You know, safety in numbers." When everyone nodded, Melissa felt the knot of worry in her chest begin to loosen. As people shouted out where they lived, groups quickly formed. Melissa smiled at Tamara as she stayed in Melissa's group. "I don't live quite as far as you," Tamara said with a smile, "but we both need to go the same way." Melissa looked at the other people in her group, a feeling of warmth spreading through her chest. These were all people she worked with and cared about, and she knew they would do all they could to help each other reach home safely. As she studied the 4 other people in her group, she silently cataloged their strengths and weaknesses. Rob, mid-30s, in reasonably good shape, smart and a problem solver, but liked to be in charge. Dylan, mid-20s, strong, but still somewhat immature. John, late 40s and in poor health, but a really nice guy. And then there was Tamara, Melissa's good friend. 8 years younger than Melissa, she was in great shape and someone Melissa cared about. She was glad to have her in her group. "What now?" Tamara asked. "It's going to be a long walk," John said. "We should take food and water with us." Worried how he would do with so much physical exertion, Melissa regarded him. Overweight, John seemed to have trouble just walking around the office without getting out of breath. Though worried, Melissa pushed it aside. They would all just have to manage the best they could. "Don't most of us have snacks at our desks?" Rob asked. "I know I do," Melissa said. Several others agreed. "Let's gather all the snacks and water bottles we can and meet back out here," Rob said. "Does anyone have a backpack or something to carry them with?" Melissa asked. 2 in the group raised their hands. "Bring those too," Rob said. The 5 of them walked toward the building, and Melissa heard some of the other groups discussing the same strategy. As she descended the stairwell, Melissa held on to the railing. "I can't see a thing," she said to Tamara, who she assumed was nearby, although she couldn't be sure. "Just be careful," Tamara said from behind her. Feeling her way, Melissa reached her cubicle. She put on her sweater. Even if she warmed up while walking, she knew she would need it eventually. Then she opened the cabinet above her desk and stuck her hand in, patting the space until she touched an item she knew was a box of protein bars. She grabbed the other items, which included a bag of dried fruit and a half-eaten box of Pop-Tarts. She took out her purse, which was basically a small backpack, and placed the food inside, then grabbed the half-full water bottle that was sitting next to her computer monitor. "How are you coming along, Tamara?" she asked into the darkness. "I'm ready," Tamara answered. "How about you?" "I just want to top off my water bottle." Tamara entered Melissa's cubicle, and they moved carefully through the darkness toward the drinking fountain Melissa always used to fill her water bottle. But when she pressed the lever, nothing happened. "Oh," she said, feeling stupid. "I guess this runs on electricity." She turned around, trying to figure out where to go. "I'm going to try the sink in the break room." A few moments later, she had her water bottle under the faucet, filling it. "I wonder how long the water will work," Tamara said. "Why wouldn't it?" "Doesn't the water company use electricity to pump the water?" Melissa hadn't thought about that. Fresh worry made her insides clench. What would happen if people couldn't get water? She didn't even want to consider that. Fortunately, they had a decent amount of water stored at their house, thanks to the suggestion of their next-door neighbor, Stan, who was into prepping. "I guess I'm ready to go," Melissa said, but she felt more unprepared than she ever had in her life. The entire audiobook of Chaos Begins will be up on YouTube by September 23rd. Thanks for listening.